This is Mara and Ben for Stellar Strategy Gaming. Today we're going to be talking about character backstories, how to make them interesting, and how to not give too much backstory.
Yes, and let us preface this by saying that the player's guide tends to define the backgrounds as, and a background is not necessarily a backstory, but they come hand in hand usually. But they define them as a lifestyle or defining event. So, for example, a lifestyle would be like the guild artisan. There's not necessarily anything special about them, but they specialize. Well, yes, there is something special about them in that they specialize in one specific field, whereas a random farmer might need to know some smithing abilities and such. A guild artisan does have only experience in, say, said smithing or glassmaking, whereas the folk hero isn't necessarily a lifestyle but that defining event. He usually stood up to the big bad that no one else would fight, and everyone clapped.
So, to be clear, your backstory does connect to your level of character, and it's kind of important that it make a certain amount of sense as to how your character got to where they are. So, for example, if you have a level 1 ranger who has this long backstory where they've fought gods and been on many adventures and on, that person wouldn't be level 1. That would be a much higher level character. So that might be appropriate for a campaign that's starting at like level 10. But if your character is level 1, then the backstory is going to be something relatively shorter, or at the very least it'll be relatively less adventure based. For example, if you have an elf, they live hundreds of years, so this person could have lived his first couple of hundreds of years as an acolyte at some temple and only taken up adventuring relatively recently.
Yes, I want to expand upon that just a little bit. I've heard this excuse be used a lot, which is, oh, well, my character, who is like a god among men, had his power taken away. No, that isn't a valid excuse for having for having that level of backstory for a level 1 character. Because if you think about it, if I've gone and fought God, or whatever it is, there's a certain level of experience I'm going to gain from fighting God. So having it be, oh, well, my power was taken, sure, that might push me down a bit, but I'm still going to understand that there are certain things that I can do, and there are certain maneuvers, for example, I could use in my fight against gods in the future, or whatever it is. So even without power, you still have experience, and so with the levels, taking your power away doesn't compensate for that level of experience you would have gained from all those events.
I would also add to that kind of thing has been done so much that to whatever extent it may have been a valid backstory at one time, it's now so generic and so much of a thing where we've heard it all before and we're not really that interested. There again, if you're starting a campaign at a higher level, as some do, or if you're introducing a new character to a campaign that's been going on for some time and the DM is having you come in at the same level as the rest of the party, then it could make a certain amount of sense. For example, you could have, say, a level 5 warlock who was something else and then lost their power, and then that was the reason for the pact they made. But it has to make a certain amount of sense with the character, and as Mara has emphasized, it's really hard to make it make sense and make it at all interesting with a level 1 character. Now, having a backstory is significant to the game and the story because it allows you to give a basis for who the character is, why they make the decisions they make, and it gives the party some way to contextualize them within the world. A particularly good example from my own past was actually my first character was a true neutral cleric, a tiefling cleric, who was on a mission to improve the reputation of the tieflings. So he had become a cleric of a good aligned god, and it created a scenario where what he was doing to maintain his god's favor wasn't necessarily what he wanted to do, and he had some internal conflict. Additionally, there was an evil half-orc monk in the party So there were some situations where he was saying, well, I'm not going to torture you for this information, but my friend here absolutely will. So it was a chance for some interesting and creative role play among the party.
Yes, and also for the new players out there, just to expand upon that a bit, a gimmick is not a backstory. Because that is another thing which people get confused about quite a bit, and just wasn't originally on the talking points for today, but after hearing that, I thought that is an important thing to emphasize as well. That character did have a few gimmicks. The gimmicks weren't the character. Whereas, for example, my very first character was a drow who had never seen sunlight and screamed every time he was exposed to sunlight. That isn't really an interesting character. That was sort of the blunder of the first character incident. But that is an important thing for you new players to remember, is that your kobold who can't speak common is not automatically an interesting character.
Yes, that's sometimes art imitates life, and I think this is a case of that. Being an edgelord is not a personality. Being loud is not a personality. And in the same way, just having a character who's sort of annoying and does the same things repeatedly and or is constantly just irksome to the party. If your backstory leads you to a lot of "it's what my character would do" explanations for why you're doing things that are pissing off your fellow players, then you need a different backstory. Also, not to get too far off topic, if your excuse is constantly "it's what my character would do," you're the one who made the character, so you the person should not make that character. It's still on you.
Yes. Now moving back on to topic a little more. I would say that short backstories can be fine. Don't make it overly simplistic. You don't want to have the fighter who just hit things when he was young, and so now he's really good at hitting things. But at the same time, you should also understand that complex is not always better. And in fact, 9 times out of 10, especially with D&D, complex is not better. For example, slightly off topic, but it actually enhances my point, there are a lot of variant rules in all of the books. No one uses those because it detracts from the fun. Same thing with backstory. I don't need to know exactly what the tastes of my characters are and exactly how many taste buds he has on the left side of his mouth, which is why he decided to go hunting for dragon meat for the rest of his life. All we need to know is that he has a taste for dragon meat, so he's going to go adventuring,
And to expand on that a little bit, there's a difference between what you write and what your DM and your fellow players need to know. For example, you could have a half-elf who one of their grandparents was an orc or something like that. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. And in a long enough campaign, that could be interesting. But when you're doing your first session or your session 0, what the DM probably is going to want is, my character's a half-elf, he's a druid, and he grew up in an elvish community within the forest, and there was some trouble in the forest, and he left to go pursue a life of adventuring to see if he could find the solution to the problems in the forest. And that's probably about as much as you truly need. When you get into this thing of, well, my character is a wood elf who found out when he was 16 years old that his father wasn't his father. His father was actually a stranger who had been passing through, and that stranger was a half-orc. And when he was 18, he ran away, and he discovered a temple, an abandoned temple to a forgotten woodland god. And then 10 minutes later, you're still rambling. And when he was 25, he discovered the orc tribe of his grandfather and learned that his grandfather had actually been a chieftain and was deposed 15 minutes later. So all he has to do is recover the shard of such and such, and he will become the orc chieftain and bring nobody cares. Now, please don't misunderstand me. If all of that comes out over the course of a months-long campaign, and you're developing this character in the eyes of the others over time, that's great. That's wonderful. It's just, you don't need to drop that on everybody in session 0 or session 1 And for the love of God, do not ever, under any circumstances, email the DM or anybody else a backstory that's more than 1 page long and expect them to read it.
Yes, we really don't need the Silmarillion, the modern Silmarillion. That's not what we're looking for here, especially because no one's finished that book. But anyway, so yes, he brings up a very good point. And also, what I tend to find with those long backstories is not only are they overly complex and an excuse for a person to do kind of stupid things to other people's characters, but on top of that, they tend to ask for extra stuff the more they add on to it. It's a similar problem with flavoring for spells and such, which we'll probably get into in a later video at some point. But, I mean, while we should always look at the story, I mean, D&D is a story-based game, it's important to remember that there are mechanics that are predefined, you know? So, I can write 3.5 pages about how my character has fought for years. Doesn't mean that I'm going to start out with 3 extra adamantine weapons or whatever it is. But I have heard players ask, oh, can I start with this flame tongue weapon and stuff like that? Not cool on their part. And as DMs, any new DMs especially who are out there, you need to say no to that stuff.
You also have to keep in mind that when you add things into your backstory, you are putting work on the DM to make it work within the world of the story, which again is one of the reasons why if you're doing anything other than just a dungeon crawl or an Adventurers League type campaign, if you're doing something where the story is important, it's really important to have a discussion with the with the DM about the world before you build your character and make sure things fit. In one of my first campaigns, one of the players' big things was that his father had been killed by an orc chieftain and he was out to avenge his father, which is fine, but it put the DM in the awkward position of having to either completely ignore this or sort of wedge it into the story. And so when the DM did, it was very sort of anticlimactic because the world wasn't right for the build-up for this villain to happen. Now, if the player and the DM had had a conversation ahead of time about this, it could have been great. It could have been that the person that this guy's been after all these years is the BBEG for the campaign, or it could be that he was wrong about who he was after. Who he thought was the villain was somebody who was enslaved to the BBEG. There's all sorts of ways you could go with that. You could make it as simple or as complex as you would like.
Yes, and again, expanding upon that a bit, I'm actually playing a bit of a gimmicky character, admittedly, right now, which is a Pixie Artificer, Pixie being a custom homebrew thing I did. But if you look at it, I didn't create this long backstory. I gave Ben, 5 sentences of detail, maybe 6. And on top of that, what I did give him, first off, I requested the campaign, so it's one of those things where it allows for a much more tailored game. In fact, something that I'll link in the description below is RuneSmith's video on letting the players write the campaign for you. But on top of that, it's basically all I said with that character was, well, Pixies aren't allowed to use metal in their home communities. Usually it's seen as a perversion of nature to harvest metal from underground. And so my character, having an innate talent for it, was exiled, became a guild artisan over time due to that innate talent. And so at the start of the campaign, where we're all level 5, my character is now of some renown due to their abilities, and also due to the world we're in. It's fairly relevant to everything that's going on with magical issues. And so it's not a lot of backstory, but it fits well within the world, and and it's vague enough that the DM can sort of twist it a bit to fit his idea of the campaign. Well,
yes, I had a character I often reference in these videos because he was one of my favorites, was my half-elf monk Chalice, who was half drow. And what I did to make his backstory sort of make sense was I referenced events from the lore. So it's something where it's not just all in my head and it's not just all me trying to convey things. It was all things that happened in the D&D lore that sort of make sense. He he was half drow. His house was Mizram, which is referenced in some of the Forgotten Realms books. He was from the city of Ched Nasad, which the Forgotten Realms books reference. Ched Nasad was destroyed, which is an event that happened in the Forgotten Realms books, and then after the city was destroyed, he escaped to the surface. So that was something where there's a real framework to work within, and it allows, if the DM has any questions, if the DM wants to work with it, they can then do that without just having to kind of delve into my imagination and work only with my imagination. And even then, what I just described, now that I laid it out, it's not super complicated. It isn't the fantasy novel that I've been working on since I was 11 years old.
Yes, and to go into that a bit more as well, actually, partially changing topics here, but one of the things which I like to look at for all of you new players who are saying, well, you've talked a lot about too long versus not long enough and such, and, well, you haven't actually given us any definitive length. And what I like to say is, I'm going to reference a show which hopefully almost everyone has seen as a personal bias, Firefly or the movie Serenity. You don't have page-long essays on all of the characters. In fact, unless you read the comics, you don't actually have all that much information on the characters, but you have enough to get the sense of who they are. Like, for example, Mal, the captain, intentionally bought a broken-down ship. He's friends with a woman of the night. He takes on passengers because he can't make enough money. Like, bam, that tells you exactly where this character is, and also the fact that he's probably one step ahead of the law due to one of those facts. And so that right there is perfect. That I maintain that Firefly is a great template for how to build characters without all that much needed to back them up necessarily, while you can still expand on them later, like as happened in the Serenity movie.
Yes, there's actually an obscure movie from the 80s, so obscure that I don't remember the name of it, where one of the characters says to the other ones, "You're probably curious about me," and the other one says, "Not particularly," and the guy just keeps rambling anyway, and that's sometimes how these backstories feel. The way I like to think about it is, if I was going to introduce you to someone you never met before, what information am I going to give you so that you can have an interaction with that person? Even if I know their life story in detail, I'm not going to give you their life story in detail. I'm going to say, this is so-and-so. He works at a hardware store. He is divorced, he has 2 kids, and his hobby is, I don't know, baseball. And based on that, you know how you're going to interact with this person. You really don't need much more than that for a D&D backstory. But, as always, Internet, tell us what you think. Tell us what works for you for backstories for your players. DMs, tell us what you want your players to give you for their characters' backstories. As always, thank you for listening.
Yes, indeed, thank you for listening. Please like and subscribe if you want to see more of this. And next time we'll be talking about...
Next time we're going to be talking about new DMs, why they're terrible, and how not to be.
Yes, we hope you enjoy.